martial arts. That means that you're training your mind and your body to be able to hurt people. Is that not correct? That's what you do. Your mind and your body, and you're also teaching other people to be able to do the same thing. So you need to have an understanding of the consequences of your actions. You're actually being held to a little bit higher standard, and a little bit more will be expected of you if you have to go to court. You have to understand that. And as Mr. Hickey said, we have Patrick Hickey. He's going to be the prosecutor, and I'm going to be the law enforcement officer. And then we're going to have three people over here, Mike and Mark and Milt, that's going to do a little scenario. And we're going to ask for you to give your input as to what you think they should be charged with, if anything. Okay? And then I will tell you what I would do as a responding law enforcement officer. I'm going to present my case to Patrick, and then he's going to tell you how he views it. Okay. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. And we have 3 or 4 scenarios that we're going to do. So having said that, anything else you want to add to that, Patrick? Okay, you want to take the floor now?
All right, I'm going to give a quick presentation on law, mostly in the state of Ohio. Before I do, though, I'd like to give a personal note on the perspective the law takes on the issue of self-defense. Every violent confrontation is unique, and people often ask me when they want to know about the law of self-defense, they want to know almost what magic words they can say to a police officer to guarantee they won't be arrested, or what magical actions they have to follow, or things they have to do to guarantee that they're always in the right. But every situation is unique. If the law were filled with bright-line rules, if it were just a magical formula, it would get things wrong every time the scenarios deviated from what they anticipated. Instead, what the law does, it places the responsibility on us to use our judgment, to behave peaceably, or where that's not possible, to behave with due care given the circumstances and given the best you can do. The law is therefore full of words like necessity or reasonably. These are words that can only be evaluated in a context, not by the law itself, but by police, prosecutors, a jury of your peers, by people. This is both a risk for us and a privilege in a way. It's a risk because you may do your honest best and in a dangerous situation that you did not create, and a jury may decide that you behaved rashly. It's also a privilege, though. In this country, you have the right to decide whether violence is necessary and appropriate, and you have the right to apply it. Men in uniform may check up on you afterwards, but the power in the moment is yours, and with that comes the responsibility. By seeking martial arts training, you've improved your ability to use this power, to execute it, but you've also trained your judgment so that you can execute it responsibly. And the goal of the presentation is to help you with the second task. I'm going to give a few words in the law. I've timed it, and so it shouldn't take more than 12 minutes, so don't worry. Then we're going to run some self-defense scenarios and let you try your hand at evaluating them. I try to achieve a balance between detail and brevity in my presentation, and we'll try to answer any questions, so you can ask anything you need to afterwards. This will mostly focus on Ohio law. I'll try and point out places where Ohio is really unusual. And you can ask questions, and we'll bring in any commentary we can from people in the audience. Anyways, self-defense centers on the necessity of using force to defend yourself or others. But there's one concept you need to know before we go in, and that is that we evaluate facts with the following rule. Whenever we're called on to decide what you thought or what you should have thought, we use 2 questions. We ask, did you actually believe the thing that you're claiming or the thing the law says you're claiming? And we ask, would a reasonable person in your circumstances, with your characteristics, have believed that? For example, in a moment we're going to discuss whether you perceived an imminent threat. That's a question not only of whether you personally actually perceived an imminent threat, but also whether a reasonable person standing in your shoes at the time, roughly like yourself, would have thought the same thing. You can have a situation where you did perceive an imminent threat, but you really shouldn't have, and you don't have an excuse for having done so. So without further delay, in a self-defense scenario, these are the concerns you're going to have to look at. The first is, as I said, whether there's an imminent threat. I'm just going to go through this list, and we'll discuss it in more detail. Whether there's an imminent threat, what sort of threat is it? Is it a threat of lethal force? Is it a threat of non-lethal force? Is force the only option for escape or protection? Are you using the least force necessary? Have you violated any duty or obligation to retreat or avoid the situation? And are you ultimately at fault somewhere in the scenario? I'm going to go through those in order to give you some detail, make sure you actually get them. Imminent threat is pretty simple. The danger that you're protecting yourself from has to be at the time of the defensive act. You can't defend yourself now against something that's likely to happen to you in the future. It has to be something that's about to happen to you right now. To give you an example that happens a lot in schools, if a kid believes he's going to be jumped after school, he can't take the guy down in third period and just say, well, I got him before he got me. I mean, you hear that, and it doesn't work that way. In general, what you want to be able to do is identify an overt act that you can articulate to the police that explains why you thought the threat was imminent. That can be a series of threatening words. That's the most difficult scenario. It's a very fine line. The question is, would a reasonable person in your shoes have thought that violence was about to happen when you decided to use physical force? The second issue is evaluating lethal versus non-lethal force. I'm going to get some comments from Sheriff Overholt on this one. But lethal includes not just likely to kill you, but also likely to cause serious bodily harm. It's in that sort of caliber. There's an issue there in terms of the deadliness of the weaponry used. There's an issue in terms of what they're likely to do with it. It's all evaluated in the circumstances. There's also some questions about deadly weapons, which I think you wanted to say a word or two about before we started. Do you want to say a word or two about deadly weapons?
Oh, yeah, let me. I'm sorry, I wasn't paying that much attention.
No, it's okay.
I never did that to the prosecutor. I listened to everything he ever said to me. Trust me. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention to you is the use of a deadly weapon. Now, let me ask you a question. If you go out here and you punch the marijuana 500 times a day, and you develop great big heavy calluses, and you have calcium buildups on your knuckles, what have you done to your hand? You've altered it, haven't you? You have made it a deadly weapon. Now, can't you just see going into court, you've hit somebody in the face, and you put his eye out and you've killed him, like Maso Yama killed the bull with his bare fist. So, here you are with an altered weapon, and you're sitting here, and here comes the prosecutor.
Ask you questions like, what sort of training do you do punching?
Well, I'm a martial artist. I've been practicing karate for 25 years, and
Do you know what
should
a
I tell him this much stuff? Okay, I'm telling you a little bit more than I should.
Do you know what a Machiwara board is?
Well, sure, it's a board grab.
Do you use one?
Well, sure I do.
And what does it do for you?
Well, it strengthens my hands, and it gives me calluses, and develops the calcium around my knuckles so I can hit harder without hurting my hand.
Can you show the jury your hand?
No. Yes. Okay.
And you see where that's going to go.
You see where that's going to go. When I was a first, second degree black belt, I used to punch the marijuana all the time, and I had the calcium built up. Let me tell you a quick little story. I went one time and gave a demonstration of the martial arts as a karate movements to the Lions, the Lions Club. The Noon Lions Club was made up of professional people. Judge was there, Judge Bob Henderson, who was the 5th District Court of Appeals judge, and 2 or 3 other attorneys, real professional people. And I gave this demonstration, and when I got done, Bill Nearhood, who's dead now, who was an attorney, he walked up to me and he said, I was a captain at the time, he said, Captain, if you ever hit anybody, I guarantee you I'm going to own everything that you have. He said, you just can't use that. So I was real careful after I kind of quit. Of course, I crushed my knuckles, but I quit. But working with my hands quite that much. You can use your body to defend yourself without having hands that look like animals or balls in hands. Pardon? Well, yeah. But the point, you understand what I'm telling you? We're talking about altering something. You can have a golf club, and if you use it, actually, if you use it as a deadly weapon, then it becomes a deadly weapon. But if you file a little sharp edge on it, then you've got a deadly weapon that you alter. You alter something to make it a deadly weapon, and it is a deadly weapon.
It's actually even a little bit worse than that. In Ohio law, the rules on what a weapon is are very subjective. If I'm carrying this pen on me with the intention of writing a report, this is not a weapon. If I'm carrying this pen on me with the intention of stabbing somebody in the neck with it, then it is a deadly weapon. The question is, can you use it as a deadly weapon, and do you mean to? And if so, it is. The same thing is true of regular weapons. I mean, it's not even a weapon at all. I'm just carrying it, and I have no intention of hurting anybody with it. The moment I decide, no, I am going to hurt somebody with this, it's a weapon now. Whether it's deadly, slightly separate question, but it's at least a weapon when I make that choice.
Just trying to open your mind up a little bit, some of the things that you could be dealing with, and altering anything to make it a deadly weapon, it becomes a deadly weapon.
Boots can be a weapon or a deadly weapon.
Okay.
All right, anyways, so that's the issues you have to deal with. The reason you want to make a decision about whether you're facing lethal or non-lethal force is, well, it'll become very important when we get to the necessity issue, but you want to make that call right away because it really scales how you're going to react and what you should do in response. The third point was that force was the only option for escape or protection. There's not much to discuss there. The point is that if you have some other option other than hurting the guy to get out of the situation, you usually should. There are some vagaries on that, but for the most part, if you can get out of the situation without violence, you're supposed to. Anyways, the interesting one that most martial artists want to know about, you're required to use the least force necessary. The least amount sufficient to stop the harm from taking place. This is another one of those reasonable person rules. We're going to ask, did you believe you used the least force necessary? And would a reasonable person in your situation at the time, with basically your characteristics, have believed that you were using the least force necessary? You can't go on to use payback. One big exception to this rule, though, that you need to know up front, is that you may not use lethal force to respond to non-lethal force. If you're dealing with somebody and you look at them and say, that guy can't kill me, you can't shoot him. Even if shooting him is the only way to stop him from punching you and pushing you around, you got to use non-lethal force. Anyways, this is a situation that considers every relevant factor. It includes size, it includes training, it includes who has weapons, it includes it for both parties. Somebody coming at you with a knife might take more to make yourself safe than somebody who doesn't. That's why the rules on deadly weapons and deadly force are important, and they apply to everybody involved in the situation. One thing I was going to add to that. Mostly it's the reasonable person situation, and the key here to remember is that you can't claim not to have known something you actually did. If you know that the particular throat strike you used had a pretty good shot at killing the guy, you can't go in there and say, well, a reasonable person wouldn't have known that, because the reasonable person is somebody with your knowledge. It's a reasonable version of you, essentially. The only thing you really the only thing you definitely can't include there, when it talks about a reasonable person, you can include history, you can even include some degree of temperament. You can't say a reasonable but violent person. You can't say a reasonable person who really likes hitting people. You can't use that. But a reasonable person basically like you with your knowledge, with your skills, with whatever you were holding, with whatever was around you, with whatever the other guy has about him, every bit of information there, we just say, what would a reasonable person in that situation have done? What choices would they have made? And notice that whether you use the least force necessary can change over the course of an encounter. I might have been using the least force necessary when I hit the guy the first time, and then in the 7th or 8th blow, maybe I've long since passed beyond the least force necessary. Maybe I'm just taking my anger out on him. Anyways, next we have issues of duties to retreat or to avoid danger. Most people don't like these because it sounds like we're telling you you have to run away. But what you should really think of it like is, if you can call the cops or just turn around and walk away, you should. And if you choose not to, the law is going to look at you like you wanted to fight. If you could have called the cops and just left, but you said, nope, I'm going to sit around and get in the fight in a couple minutes, well, you asked for the fight to a degree. There are some exceptions to that. There's no duty to retreat in the threat of non-lethal force. There's a very big gap in that. That's in Ohio, at least. If somebody's going to punch you in a few minutes, you don't have to retreat. You can stand your ground on that. There's also no duty to retreat in your own home or your own car against somebody who doesn't also belong there. So there is a duty to retreat if you're dealing with two people who live in the same place. But if you live there and, Mr. Burns doesn't, I wouldn't have a duty to retreat versus Mr. Burns if he's in the house. With one exception. This is the exception to the exception, so we all love this. If you are the aggressor, you always have a duty to retreat. Now that may sound like a really strange thing to say. The attacker has a duty to retreat. He's the guy who committed the assault. But what you really should think about it as is, if you've committed an assault and you're in the progress of continuing to commit the assault, you have an obligation to stop. And that's what that duty to retreat is important for. final matter is whether you're not at fault. If you're at fault in creating the scenario, you have no self-defense right. At fault basically means that you started it, you were the aggressor, some matter of that degree. But there's one exception, and that is, remember how we said that if you were the aggressor, you had a duty to retreat? If you do successfully retreat, you get your self-defense right back. Know that you have to succeed. Doesn't just mean that you tried really hard. If you're trying to get away and the other guy's hitting you, that's not successfully retreating. Now, these rules shouldn't be too important to you because this only applies to people who are aggressors in a fight. And I'm sure none of you will do that. But that's what happens with that. If somebody is in a fight with you and they try to get away and they do, and you go after them again, we count it as a whole new fight from the start to finish. And the self-defense rights will be recalculated at the beginning of the new confrontation. So that covers the basic law of self-defense. I'm not going into all the millions of details on it, but it gives you the broad strokes. There's one other matter I want to bring up before we do our scenarios, and that's defense of others. In many states, the rule on defense of others is that you have to make the same call as a reasonable person that you do in any other situation. Would a reasonable person have perceived that they were acting in defense of another person? Not in Ohio. Ohio follows the minority rule on this. In Ohio, if you are defending someone else, you are borrowing their right of self-defense. If they didn't have one, there's nothing for you to borrow. So let me give you an example case that actually happened in our state. Guy comes out on his porch because he hears an altercation, and he comes out on his porch with his rifle, and he sees two people, a man and a woman, struggling, and there's a knife involved. I think the guy had it at the time, and there's blood on both of them. The woman yells that the man sexually assaulted her. So the guy on the porch takes a shot. Bullet hit the man in the neck. It didn't kill him, but really messed him up. Well, turns out that upon actual investigation by the police, it was a domestic dispute. The woman had pulled the knife on the man. Blood was mostly from minor cuts while the guy was taking the knife away from her. And they were now struggling over everything in their entire relationship. But nobody was out to kill anybody at that point. Nobody was sexually assaulting anybody. Well, even if a reasonable person would have pulled that trigger, it doesn't matter. He only had the right to defend her if she had the right to defend herself. And because she started the fight, she was the aggressor, she did not have a right to defend herself. She had only a duty to retreat, which is obviously no legal protection. So in that case, he got in, probably went to jail for a few years for that. I think that covers the basics of the law. I'm just going to go straight into some scenarios. When we do these, please remember that, I just talked on and on about how you assume that person in that person's circumstances. Don't pretend they're that people, the specific people. Don't think these are three black belts getting in fights in bars. Think these are three black belts playing guys getting in fights in bars. So no reasoning that, we might have to drop Pizer really fast because he's a dangerous guy. Just assume he's just some guy in wherever getting in this sort of fight. So let's go to scenario one. Sheriff, do you want to come up here and we'll start running scenario one?
Scott, can you move over? Scott, Lon, can you move over?
I'm an observer, by the way.
Six-ball side pocket. All right. Eight ball. What are you looking at? Get out of here. Leave now. When this game is done, I am going to shoot you. Go. Get at him. Your turn. Crap, you got it again.
All right. Let's say you saw that or you heard about that scenario. Who thinks, I want to see a show of hands first. Who thinks the cops should arrest this guy? All right. Next, show of hands. Who thinks the cops should arrest that guy? All right, so already we have a split. And remember, the rules are that this will be judged in the ultimate by a jury. There will be some filtering from the police, and then the jury will make a call based on what they think was reasonable behavior by the people involved. So there may not be a perfectly true answer. This is the sort of thing where it's human beings have to do our best on it. But let's go around the room a little bit and ask why you made the call you did. So somebody who wanted to arrest Mills, raise their hand. All right.
Time to walk away and alleviate the situation before it escalated.
All right, time to walk away. Anybody have a different reason? All right.
Yeah, Mr. Pfizer didn't enter his personal space yet. He
All right.
charged into the space.
All right. And you also have a argument with that.
In addition, although he said that he was going to shoot him, there may not have been a gun there. We didn't see a gun.
All right. Anybody else want to support this side with a different reason? We got all of them. All right. Who would have arrested him? All right. And why?
I think there were threatening comments at the beginning, verbal comments at the beginning, and then, Mr. Pfizer made threatening physical moves forward to rescue, but then he defended himself, although it was very aggressive, but I would sense that he was going to be attacked physically.
All right. Who else supports that side?
Could you arrest them both? Him for menacing and him for assault?
You could conceivably arrest them both. Who would arrest them both? Raise your hands. Who would arrest everybody? Okay. Hey, I can tell you, I've had at least one time in the prosecutor's office where the prosecutor was so upset that they had to arrest somebody. They felt just emotionally like it wasn't quite right to arrest the person until they finally realized there was a charge they could get the other guy on. And once they could arrest everybody, they felt fine about it. So that's the way some people think. All right. Anybody who only wanted to arrest him, though, want to raise their hand? Anyone? Yes?
Just to arrest Mr. Pfizer?
Yeah, and a reason.
Yeah, he was the one who made the aggressive advance towards him, and as you said before, he'd already threatened him, so he acted reasonable to defend himself.
Okay. Anybody from the both who wants to raise their hand and say why real fast? We already had one, but any more comments on that? Okay, I think we covered it. Well, Sheriff Overholt arrives on the scene.
Well, that's exactly right. I arrived at the scene. I was apprehended. I did not see this. So I'm conducting an investigation. Mr. Prosecutor, as a result of my investigation, I found out that he did threaten Mill. But when he was back here at the pool table, and this came from some people other than his friends, he said, I feel so bad about that. I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to go up and apologize to him. As he walked up, Mill hit him. So he's charged with assault, and I'm going to arrest him.
Okay.
Okay?
Anybody want to argue with that? You can if you want. No?
Bobby, what would you do?
He said he's not going to arrest you.
Yeah, what would you do?
I probably would have ended up arresting both just because the comment of the "I am going to shoot you" was a definitive statement. And you can come and try to take it back, but you made a thing. If he felt that he was actually being menaced or whatever, I arrest both of them.
Sean, what would you do?
Yeah. Aggravating, I think. But he didn't show a gun, so just right.
I probably would just arrest Pfizer.
Okay.
I would say Mr. Pfizer's attitude and walk was not consistent with somebody about to apologize.
I talked to him about that. Okay? He was supposed to walk up very.
Oh, okay.
Well, there's two ways to look at it. One is, as a prosecutor, I would probably feel comfortable going with the sheriff's recommendation on that. I'm not a prosecutor at the time, but so when I say that, I'm not speaking for myself at the moment. But if I were a prosecutor, I would probably feel comfortable going with the sheriff's recommendation. I could also see doing the menacing charge. There's something called prosecutorial discretion, where you don't have to charge every single thing that's been committed. So it's possible I might say, he got smashed. I don't know if I want to prosecute him with menacing. I think it might just be not worth my time. I might have more important cases to handle with bigger crimes. But then I might do it too. I can't say that I wouldn't do a menacing charge for a problem for me. The real question is, one, duty to retreat. That's, I forget who mentioned the time to walk away. You were threatened with lethal force, and there's a duty to retreat in the case of lethal force. Of course, retreat has to be safe and possible and all that, but there's that out there. So that's probably going to sink you right there. But beyond that, I think that jumping the gun. I think that was majorly jumping the gun myself. But again, it's a question that's going to be asked, would a reasonable person in his circumstances, with his knowledge of this guy and what he saw, have drawn the conclusion that he needed to throw that punch? And it is certainly possible that if you put 12 reasonable people in a room, they would disagree on that question.
I have to follow your plan about jumping the gun. If he said, I'm gonna shoot you versus I'm gonna kick your ass.
That would change it, because then
Right,
there'd be
that's why I thought Hosworth got arrested.
Oh, yes, sir.
The degree of injury that came about from this confrontation have anything to do with
Very little.
your reason to prosecute or not?
Okay, well, there's two questions there. The question of whether it would affect my decision to prosecute, yes. It would definitely affect my decision to prosecute. Just as a human being, I think that any prosecutor is more likely to press charges in a shaky situation. Like if you think, I got an 80% chance that pressing charges is the right call, and this guy's really, really hurt, that's going to push you. Versus, well, you know, nobody really got hurt, he got right back up and was fine. You know, you might take a attack on that. Now, as far as the law is concerned, you know, leaving aside issues of prosecutorial discretion, the law won't necessarily worry too much about how badly the guy was hurt. The question is going to be, was what he did, he didn't have a duty to retreat, was what he did something a reasonable person in his situation would think was necessary to stop an imminent threat of some sort of physical violence? So the degree of force would only come into it if you were to say that he hit the guy more than he needed to. I mean, a single punch, you know, it'd be a hard argument to make, but you can try. Yes?
I had a question. I mean, if you're just standing there minding your own business and somebody comes up and tells you what to do, I mean, do you really have a duty to leave the situation?
With a
Do you
lethal
know
force,
if you're really going to do something or
with a
not?
lethal force scenario in the state of Ohio, yeah. But don't think necessarily like, oh, I have to put down my head and walk away. You just tell the bouncer. You know, there are a dozen different things you could do. The point is, you have to, if you have an option other than violence, you're expected to take it. And standing your ground and just waiting for the fight because you think you can take the guy, well, I mean, you can do that in a non-lethal scenario, but you're really putting yourself at risk if you decide, yeah, I'm going to stand my ground and take this guy down, just because I can, even though I could leave. You're really treading a line there. Yes?
Does the credibility of, he said he had a gun, but since it wasn't presented, if you didn't think it was a credible lethal threat, would that make
That would come into it. Remember, since the question is, what did he believe was going on, and what would a reasonable person believe was going on? If I could say, you know, let's say I could prove somehow, he knew he didn't have a gun. He saw the guy earlier without his jacket on, he knew the guy didn't have a gun. Then, yeah, I could say, well, this is not a situation where he's dealing with a lethal force threat because he knows the guy has no means of carrying out the threat. But of course, you'd have to prove that that was true. Likewise, if the fact that the gun wasn't shown, I mean, that's, the question is whether he reasonably believed it was there. And the fact that it wasn't shown is evidence, but it's not conclusive. You know what I mean? Even if I don't show you a gun, if I make you believe I have it, then that's that. Yes?
I think we're all in trouble here because we had 3 law enforcement officers
We all
here that
disagree.
had 3 different opinions,
Yes.
and the prosecutor was happy with whatever the officer said.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's nothing new.
Badge of authority.
Yeah. What I'm trying to impress upon you is that you really can have reasonable disagreements. And so the point is you do your best to be on the right side and to be with clean hands. I mean, credibility can come up. A lot of this wasn't based on testimony, but, you know, maybe he heard 10 different versions of the story from 10 different guys, and he based it on the one he believed the most. You know, you have to start going back through that as a prosecutor. From your perspective, just, you know, try to be a credible, honest-looking guy. All right, we gotta move to the next one. All right, this is the,
Hey, you, Brent, get out of my way. Now, Harry Potter.
all right, comments? Any comments? First, who would arrest this guy, right? Only this guy. Who would raise your hand? Who would arrest only this guy? Raise your hand. Anybody arrest nobody? All right. Anybody arrest everybody? Everybody? Both people? No, okay.
Mr. Keppel wants to go ahead and let him fight.
I saw that. I caught that. All right. Real fast. We got to go through this one real quick. We can do this one a couple different ways. Those who would arrest him. Anybody want to make a comment? I don't think there were anybody who really wanted to arrest him as well. Anybody who wanted to arrest him? Want to say why? Didn't walk away. Anything else?
There was no non-lethal force. He was known.
Yeah, there wasn't even a threat in that one. There was just some words. Now, the fact that the words didn't specifically make a threat doesn't mean that nothing was threatened. I can threaten somebody without saying I am going to hit you if I use body language to make it clear that I am going to hit them. But you got to prove that. So, yes?
I mean, what about the size difference? Because one's larger,
That was
one's
intentional.
the other guy's smaller. I mean, he's got to lose if this guy initiates the fight. So.
That was an intentional call on that. We made sure we had a taller and a shorter person on that one. And that can be a factor. Like I said, you take into account the actions of a reasonable person in the situation, and to be a reasonable person with his characteristics, his hypothetical characteristics as some guy off the street. And so, if he's smaller and the guy's bigger, you're going to feel a different degree of threat than in a different scenario. Yes?
So, since
But, just a second. Let's do the other two, and I think that's going to actually cover a lot of the questions we're about to have here. So, let's do that.
Hey, Brent, get out of my way. Get out of my way!
All right, break. Now, who arrests him? Who arrests him?
Punched me.
No one? Who arrests everybody? All right, he arrests everybody. Who arrests nobody? Okay. Somebody who arrests him, raise your hand and tell me why. Sir?
He made a physical altercation first. He actually laid his hands on him, so he had reasonable justification to feel he was in threat of harm.
All right, anybody else want to throw in a reason? Yes?
The size difference, just even though he's just pushing him, would lead me to believe there's a good possibility he's going to follow up with a strike. There's a great deal of threat on the part of the smaller person.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure.
Let's let her comment.
I'm not sure this gentleman really had enough time to retreat.
Okay. Yeah, there's probably those 100 feet. Sir?
Yeah, I don't think Mr. Fitzvinsky that gave him enough time to retreat.
Yeah, there's probably no retreat issue here. And it's also non-lethal force most likely, so retreat probably isn't a concern. Okay, anybody want to arrest him? Nobody wants to arrest him. Nobody wants to give any reason to arrest him. All right, so we've seen two different scenarios. You want to give your opinion on the first one and then on the second one?
Well, the first one,
The first one was the first one was the verbal attack, but no physical contact. So he's
okay, I'd arrest him.
okay.
I'd arrest Mark, period. Second one, both of them. Both of them I'd arrest. And to begin with, I wanted to tell you this. This took place in a bar. When I went to a barroom fight, I had very, very little tolerance. I went in there thinking, I'm going to calm everything down. I'd arrest both of them.
Okay.
Second time.
Do we have any law enforcement people who disagree? No? Disagree? Okay. And do you want to tell which charges you'd slap on him?
Let's see, let me think here a second. One would be menacing and one would be assault.
Okay. Menacing for the
The
push?
assault, menacing for, and assault for the strike.
Yeah. Remember, the question, merely touching somebody isn't necessarily a criminal assault. The question is, what sort of harm is likely to result from it? What sort of harm do you intend? What sort of harm happen? Those sorts of issues. And so, you can make a good argument that just pushing him maybe wasn't enough, but it could be menacing, that you could have made him, menacing is, if I make you afraid that I'm going to hit you, that's menacing. If I actually hit you, that's assault. That's the short version of this. All right, let's do, yes?
You mentioned size as a factor. What about gender, for instance? What if he had been a woman? Is that in consideration?
Gender is certainly in consideration. And the question is, would a reasonable person of that gender?
Women would have been much more dangerous, so.
What about health condition? If Mark was likely to be more susceptible to injury from a simple shove?
That can really, that can make things really difficult because the question is, all right, let's say that hypothetically this guy has some sort of medical condition that makes him incredibly fragile boned, and if he falls down, he could die. He knows that. Well, that's a bad example because he wouldn't punch him, probably. But let's say he has some medical condition that makes this really hazardous situation. He knows that. He knows he's at risk, serious risk. He doesn't. So you might have a situation where he's justified in protecting himself, but where he's not necessarily at heightened fault. You know, he didn't intend to create a greater threat. Now, if he actually did push him and he died, then we can get it on that, because you're held responsible for the victims you have, not the victims you thought you had. But in terms of menacing versus assault, I think that would actually be a big factor there. Do you want to disagree on that, or do you think that's probably correct? That's a tough question. Think that's good? Sir?
Just another question. I mean, we're taught not to let the push happen, right? So in this, when it starts moving, in theory, we're supposed to start moving.
Yeah.
So how do we know it was going to be a push? How do we know it wasn't going to be a
That's a good
punch to
question.
the face?
What's a reasonable person in your situation likely to decide?
Well, we don't know it's a push because hopefully we're not going to.
Yeah.
You don't sit there and take
And
it.
what I tell you is, in different courses where we have time to really do like verbal confrontations, we'll do scenarios where I'll actually get in the guy's face and I'll start shooting him out. The question is getting him to respond correctly. You don't want to be doing this with somebody where you don't have time to react. You just don't want to be in that. I'm sure you probably teach your kids that. You want to be like, come on, man. Back here where if he goes to push me, I've got all the time in the world to figure out, can I just do this? Do I got to hit him? Do I have at least more time to make that decision? So that's more of a tactical choice. Yeah?
By definition, it seems like you're almost implying that it's better to take the first punch.
Legally. Yeah, the question is, if you don't take the first punch, if you get him before he can get you, can you prove he really was going to get you, or that a reasonable person in your circumstances would have made the same decision as you? You're increasing your liability, your likelihood of responsibility, criminal responsibility, the more difficult it is for you to prove that your use of force was reasonable. So when it's really obvious that your use of force was reasonable because the guy pounded on you, then you have much lower criminal exposure. Whereas if you did get him like that, well, it might have been reasonable, but you got to demonstrate it in the court of law, and it becomes harder. So yes, there is definitely a tension between really effectively putting the guy down and minimizing your criminal exposure, and you have to make a call in the circumstance.
Then an add-on question.
Yeah.
If I wasn't trained,
Yeah.
i.e. didn't have a black belt, I'd be in a better situation, wouldn't I?
Except you might lose the fight.
Yeah.
It's certainly true that I could go in there as a prosecutor, and I could say, this guy's a black belt. He's done this a million times in a gym. I'd have you elaborate on that. I'd make you. And then I'd say, come on, he thought that was a real threat to him? Are you kidding me? And I'd make my case. And your side would make the case that no, with his heightened awareness of the situation, he correctly appraised that this guy was a serious hazard, and he put him down in the most efficient way he could. And we'd put it before the jury. All right, we have one more. We have two more. Let's do the reverse. Yeah. We discussed a few of these issues. You step up and kind of step up. Yeah. Somebody to crash into his head without.
You've been bugging me all night. I really don't know what your problem is. Leave me alone.
All right, stop. Hypothetically, let's say that he hit right after the push too, instead of having a slight delay. He pushes him, and it's just boom. Who would arrest him? Okay. Who would arrest him? Who would arrest no one? Who would arrest everyone? A lot of everyone's. All right, let's go through this relatively quickly. For him, somebody raise a hand and give a reason. Sir?
The threat is not serious in size, appearance, or anything else. And he obviously, with multiple punches, is
It's true.
going.
What if it was only one punch?
I'm sorry?
What if it was only one punch?
It's probably size difference and
Would be enough.
what the one punch would do to somebody like him would be.
Not actually.
Thank you.
All right. One more for Mills. One more for arresting Mills here. Nobody else wants to arrest Mill? Or nobody else wants to talk and arrest Mill? All right. Arresting Mark. Or Mike. Mike. Yeah, sorry.
We still initiated contact, but when it goes in front of a jury, they would be looking at the size issue.
Okay. Anybody else arresting him who wants to give a comment? No? Okay. Arresting both was by far the most popular. Who wants to arrest both and wants to say why? Sir?
Yeah, Mike initiated the contact and also in the back. At any point, he didn't have to initiate the contact, Mike didn't have to initiate the contact. No, when he was pushed, he could have turned it off the way.
Okay.
And he hit back.
Okay. Yes?
Obviously, it's been an ongoing thing throughout the night. Neither one of them retreated.
Remember, retreat is a special word for violent, for lethal force.
Okay.
But it's true that neither one of them walked away, and you could use that. While there may not be a duty to retreat for non-lethal force, I can certainly use the fact that you guys have been going at it all night as evidence of what you were thinking when you went into that fight. So it may not be a legal duty, but I can say, well, you know, the question is, did he really hurt the guy? Was that why he went into this? The accusation, well, yeah, you can do it all night. Anybody else or both who wants to say why?
I think they were both somewhat inebriated and didn't have control of either of the so.
That's another, incidentally, when it comes to discussing what a reasonable person in your circumstances would do, the fact that you were drunk doesn't help. You don't ask what a reasonable drunk person would do. It comes up in every law class, and we don't do that. The only way intoxication can get you out of a crime is if you literally can't control your own limbs. So, yeah. Sir, where do you go?
Mr. Prosecutor, I would arrest both of them. After all, Mark, he initiated it verbally and physically, so I would take him for menacing and I would take no for assault.
Okay. On the grounds that the menacing wasn't enough to justify the self-defense you used?
No.
That sounds reasonable to me. I might be a little shaky on doing menacing and an assault charge, just because I might be worried. Yeah, well, I might just doing both at once, because I might be worried that if I win the menacing, they're going to bring that in and say, well, if he menaced him, he made him believe that he was going to get hit. So if that happened, then he can't have assaulted him. He must have been using self-defense. So I might be a little shaky in doing both at once.
So where would you go?
I'd probably go for the guy who did the bigger charge. I'd probably go for the assault charge. Give me a choice. All right, final scenario. You two witnesses. Okay, no speaking on this one, just imagine this is happening.
Yeah! Come here, you elephant!
Stop? Thanks. All right, you have to stay back up. You know. All right. Okay. That one's a little more involved in terms of action. So, remember we're going to ask 4 ways. You know, one, the other, everyone, both. So, one, the other, no one, both. First, who arrests just this guy? All right, who arrests just this guy? Remember, he threw the first shot there at the beginning. Who arrests nobody at all? I'm not expecting any hands of that. Or who arrests everyone? Okay, now the real question is who can articulate a reason why? So let's go with the everyone, because that was by far almost everybody in the room. So I'm trying to get people who haven't raised their hands before. If possible, right now, if you haven't raised your hand before and you voted everyone, let's see a hand. Come on, somebody, there's a lot of people. Yes?
He hit him first. When he hit back, he tried to get away and he kept going after him.
And you get them for the keep continuing?
Yeah.
All right. Who else wants to vote for everyone and articulate a reason? Or is that pretty much what everybody was thinking when they gave their reason? All right. Rather than immediately go, well, let's just do my slow motion version of it. All right. Come back out. We're doing the same thing in slow motion. All right. And I'm going to tell them to stop me so often, and I'll talk about what's happening. Sir? All right. Freeze for a second. I would say pretty clearly he's just committed an assault. He just walked up and slugged the guy. I mean, leaving aside hypothetical things that could have happened before this, all things being equal, that was obviously an assault. There's no real question. He's walking up. All right, go ahead. All right, freeze for a second. Okay, I think pretty clearly he had a legitimate right to take a swing back. He's probably going to get hit a second time. He wants to stop that from happening, so he's going to take a shot back. Keep going. All right, stop. Remember, the rules were that you have the right to use the least amount of force necessary to prevent the violent contact from continuing. At some point, there's no magic line, but at some point, while he's trying to get away, you probably are going to expire your right to keep hitting him. Now, once that happens, everything after that is an assault. become an assault retroactively, but everything after it will be an assault. So he continues, go ahead. All right. Boom. Okay, stop. He was trying to get away. Yeah, you can get back on task. He was trying to get away. He was trying to retreat, and this is the duty to retreat rules for the aggressor. He was trying to get out of the fight, but his right to self-defense does not renew unless he actually succeeds in getting out of the fight. Even if he was making a genuine effort to escape the fight that he started, it doesn't matter. Yeah, you don't get your self-defense right back because you lost. That's the short version of it. So when he was trying to get away, that was the right thing to do, but even though he couldn't get away, he can't come back to protect himself without legal exposure for it, because he started the fight. It's just a continuation of his original assault. The only way he can get his self-defense right back is if he left the scenario entirely, and maybe if he went out to his car to run away, and he followed into the parking lot, then we'd probably call it a new fight, and we'd charge with a new assault. So in this case, I think it's
Well, I suggest, Mr. Prosecutor, we get the security tape, bring it in, play it in slow motion, then I look at it and decide who's going to.
And once we did that, I think it's going to be everybody.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah. All right, I think that covers our scenarios. I don't know how much time we have. I didn't bring the clock up here with me. 5 minutes? All right, we can take some questions and answers for anybody, including, yes?
Well, the question, typically we're taught to make sure that if somebody starts an altercation, that you want to make sure that he's not in a condition to continue. That's typically going to involve him not moving, or at least that's my interpretation. So it seems that there
is a slight mismatch
there between what the law is and what our teachings are.
There is a slight mismatch.
That's the question there. And also, second question would be, let's say somebody is verbally assaulting you, he may not indicate he has a gun, but he comes up to you in a threatening manner, and he's reaching for something. At what point in time, I mean, by the time you wait to see what he's drawing out, be it a gun or a knife, you're already at a disadvantage. Either you have split-second timing, or you're going to take a chance that this person is not bringing out a handkerchief. How is that addressed in terms of law?
Let me go to the first question. The mismatch between put them in a condition where they literally cannot continue to fight you versus what the law says. The law says the least amount of force necessary. And necessary is being judged by what a reasonable person in your circumstances would believe was the least amount of force necessary. The law is where the difference is likely to show up is the law has a good chance of looking at the situation and saying he was capable of continuing to attack you, but he wasn't going to. And a reasonable person in your situation would have recognized that this guy was done. Sure, he could fight, but you've taken it out of him, and that's the end of the conversation. You no longer have the right to keep going. So at the point where maybe I'm the attacker and I could keep fighting you, but clearly you've knocked the wind out of my sails and I just want to get away, that's it. You don't get to put me down. You have to make the call that he's out of it. But it's a reasonable person standard, and there is some ambiguity there. You can say that, sure, I didn't have the time to make a perfect judgment in hindsight, and you're not required to. You can say, I reasonably believe that 1 or 2 more hits were necessary to make sure he didn't come back in. That slight stagger back wasn't obviously an effort to leave to me. That sure didn't seem like it, and the reasonable person wouldn't have thought it was. And you'd have the argument, and the prosecutor would have to decide whether to prove your guilt in the center of the law. As for the second question, which was the reaching for something inside their jacket, the only thing I can do there is I can reiterate the reasonable person standard. Would a reasonable person in your situation have felt that you needed to get that guy before he threw what was in his pocket? And that can be judged based on the circumstances. How threatening was he? All sorts of little judgments like that really do matter because we're trying to judge the actual circumstance that actually happened. And so, yeah. Do you have a comment on the gun issue? Okay. Yes.
Your definition of lethal force, what if there is multiple attackers?
Multiple attackers? That can change things. Yeah. I mean, if your argument is that, that guy alone probably wouldn't beat me to death, but those 8 guys sure would have. Yeah, that can change things.
It can change the level of what force
Yeah.
you use.
That can change the situation. Certainly. Yes?
I just get back, one thing you have to remember is that we have to take into consideration is, where was it at?
Yeah.
Was it dark, was it cold? I All these things enter into something, a decision-making process when you're involved in a confrontation. What was it, an over riot? Or in a bar that they were fighting. You know, all these things come into consideration. And those are the things a law enforcement officer always has to take into consideration. And the prosecutor, when we prepare and present a case or when we make an arrest, you know, you talk about how do you know? How does a law enforcement officer know, for example, and I'm speaking from being a law enforcement, whether the guy pulls out a squirt gun or does he have a real gun? You know, you're going to wait and see if he gets squirted, or you're going to take the necessary action. Those are things, these are judgment calls. These are things that you have to deal with. Law enforcement deals with it, and everybody deals with it. And it's a judgment call. Sometimes it's not a clear answer. It just isn't a clear answer. You agree with that?
Yeah, and the best thing I can say on the gunning thing is, if you genuinely believe that you're better off taking him down than letting him draw it, well then, I mean, it'd be crazy for me to say not to. I can't say that it won't lead to legal exposure, but if you genuinely believe you're going to die if you don't do it, you know, I'm not going to tell you, you should risk going to jail, you know, risk dying to avoid going to jail. I'm not going to say that. You know, you have to make the call yourself, and then you'll have to defend it later.
Then the burden of proof falls upon who?
Oh, yeah, burden of proof. In general, in a criminal case, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the person's guilt. But there's something called affirmative defenses. Those are issues where the accused has to prove it themselves. Self-defense is an affirmative defense. You have to prove you use self-defense. I don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you didn't. You have to present it yourself and make the argument. Yes, sir?
Is there anything specifically to gender? I mean, if you take in a woman and put a woman in with one of the men there instead of
Gender is a
men
factor,
fighting.
but it's a factor because of how it affects the situation. So if you say, because I'm female, I'm smaller, I have, you know, whatever, I'm less likely to be able to take this guy apart, he's much bigger than me, that's something. You can say, because I'm female, I perceived the situation differently. There's no magical rule that says women have this rule and men have this rule. But, and certainly you get a situation where, you know, yeah, it was a female victim, but she's a female heavyweight champion, and it doesn't matter. It's all about the person in question and their characteristics, and gender applies to the degree that it affects the characteristics that are relevant to the competition. And Danny had his hand up first.
Two questions then. If one of the people is a minor involved, how is that reflected in the law?
Okay, well, it can affect what you're likely to be charged with. In terms of affecting your right to self-defense, I don't believe there is any effect. I mean, the minor has the same right to self-defense that an adult does, and the adult versus the minor is going to have the same right to self-defense. Except, of course, you know, if the minor is obviously not going to be able to hurt me because they're just too small, you know, like, that's where you're dealing with the question of the people and their reasonable expectations and their actual beliefs at the time. So there's no magical rule I don't think I can think of that applies to minors that would change how they would operate, except to the degree that the fact that they're a minor changes their ability to engage in violence, changes their ability to retaliate, and so on.
You're not supposed to be in the bar.
Oh yeah, you really shouldn't be in the bar.
The second question would be, if it seems like your actions would be largely determined by if the weapon's lethal or non-lethal, but you said
it's almost impossible to know. Yes.
For like the hand, if it's a trained karate person, how do you determine if that'll be viewed as a lethal or non-lethal?
Well, did they die? I mean, that's a silly
So
answer,
that's
but it's the first question I ask. As just anybody involved in the legal system, I'm a million times more likely to call it a lethal weapon if the guy died. Now, beyond that, that somewhat flippant but real answer, did you intend the person to die and have a reasonable expectation that it would happen? And was that reasonable expectation like a realistic one? You know, if you intend to beat somebody to death with your shoe or punch them until they die, I could call that a lethal weapon, quite possibly. Or I just call it lethal force flat out. If there was a chance of you actually succeeding. In general, you make the call. What degree of threat am I facing? Is this a threat that I'm going to get beaten up a little bit? Is it a threat that I may die or be permanently maimed? And you retaliate proportionally to what you're facing. Now, in general, what you shouldn't need to worry about is this. The idea that we're just going to declare your hands to be lethal weapons and therefore you can't use any self-defense against anybody who doesn't have a gun. That's not the concern. It's not like there's a magical switch we turn and say, you got your black belt, you're a lethal weapon now. So remember when we said you can't use lethal force against non-lethal force? You just have to sit out every fight and take your shots. That's not going to happen. it's a judgment call based on the scenario and based on what people are likely to accomplish with the techniques they use. And so, if you're trying to kill a guy, I would probably try to get you as much as I could. If you're not, probably not. Next question. Sir.
In a situation where you're defending somebody else maybe, and there's a clear difference, clearly dominant person, whether it's a large man and a child or a smaller woman or something like that, can that person be using lethal force in your involvement against a clearly weaker person?
Remember, in Ohio at least, the rule is you're borrowing the self-defense right of the person you're defending. And so, if that person had reason to believe they were risking dying, then absolutely, that would be a lethal force scenario, and you could respond with lethal force. However, if you're wrong in Ohio, it's not a matter of whether you reasonably believe it, it's a matter of whether you're right or wrong. In Ohio, there is extra exposure for defending other people.
You could shoot them across the street, and if they were really going to kill that other person, then you're justified?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if that person was legally entitled to shoot the guy, then you shooting the guy is, you'd count that guy's row.
Are we done?
I think we're there. You want closing remarks or anything?
No, not right now. So thank you very much.